And
over.
Howard, I'm going to turn it over to you.
No, it's not you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Judy.
Wait, Howard, you need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Howard,
There.
there we go. Okay,
Okay.
great.
Hi, you ready? Hi,
Yes.
this is Howard Rader. I came across Max Gross quite by accident about a year ago. Found his book, The Lost Shtetl, read it, loved it, and sent him my first ever fan letter. Max responded. We've been corresponding ever since. I invited him to speak to our fellow group. I thought he had something to say, and I knew that our group would enjoy listening to him. Max is from New York, grew up in Brooklyn. He is the son of two writers, graduated from Dartmouth College, lived in Israel for a while, and has worked for the Forward and the New York Daily Post. He is currently editor-in-chief of the Commercial Observer, which is a weekly real estate publication. The Lost Shtetl is his first book, and I understand he's working on some new material now. Max just won the Best Fiction Award from the Association of Jewish Libraries, along with a $1,000 cash award. So coffee will be on him afterwards. I present to you my new best friend, Max Gross.
Thank you, Howard, my new best friend. And hello to everybody in St. Louis. Before I get to the novel, I would like to tell you just how excited I am to do this event. What Howard said is, completely true. It was he contacted me out of the blue, telling me about how much he liked the book, and saying that if there was a movie version, it should not star Tom Hanks. And I think a wonderful friendship was formed over email and over the phone, and here we are today. And it was really so wonderful for me because this is, Howard is the reason that, it was so gratifying to hear from him. I mean, all I ever really wanted for this book was for people like Howard to enjoy it, to enjoy the time they spent with it. And so I was just so happy to do it with him. And what he said about, me and my bio is, 100% true. I grew up in Brooklyn. I went to Dartmouth, and after school, I moved to Israel for a year, which was a very interesting formative experience for me. And when I came back, my first job in journalism was indeed at the Forward newspaper, which I'm sure a lot of you will know as the English language sister publication to the Yiddish Vorwärts, which back in the day was, I think, the most popular Yiddish newspaper published. And while I was at the Forward, I had what I like to call the freak beat, in that I was essentially the person that they'd give a story to that they had no idea who to give it to. I didn't write about politics. I didn't write about, education. So when there was something, a miscellaneous story, they would hand it to me. So I remember I stumbled upon a website called Jews for Allah, which was essentially an attempt to do what Moshe Rosen did back in the 1970s with Jews for Jesus. And I wrote up Jews for Allah. So I would go out to Bethel, Connecticut for the afternoon and listen to the founder of Jews for Allah's spiel. And this guy who came up with Jews for Allah, he was a really nice guy, but wasn't Jewish in any way, whereas Moshe Rosen did have Jewish parents. But when I asked this guy how steeped he was in Jewish literature, he told me he reads the New York Times every day, which I thought was very funny, but I thought he was a very hospitable guy. And I did stories about the invention of the flagel, the flat bagel. I did stories about Mel Brooks and competitive gefilte fish eating contests in Sheepshead Bay, and a Dybbuk haunted wine cabinet that was being auctioned off on eBay. But one of the more popular stories I ever wrote was about New Square, New York, which is a suburb of New York City. It's about an hour and change outside of the city. And maybe it was a perm prank or who knows what it was, But one day in a fish market up there, a carp apparently looked up and started talking in Hebrew to the guy who was about to fillet him. And the carp claimed that he was the transmogrified soul of a departed Hasid known in the town. And after speaking, the fish jumped onto a pile of other fish before it could be isolated and interrogated more fully. So the transmogrified soul of this guy was forever lost. But my editor said, brilliant, got to go up to New Square and write about it. And I remember getting off the bus up there and feeling like I had stepped into a strange replanted shtetl. It wasn't straw roofs and dirt roads, but if you wanted to live the shtetl life in upstate New York with modern architecture and infrastructure and an SUV instead of a horse and cart, this would be it. As I crossed the street, there was literally a flock of geese passing before me. When I was doing the story, I decided I was going to wear a yarmulke while I was up there to fit in and be trusted, which is a terrible idea. There's an old rule of reporting from Tom Wolfe that rather than blend in, you should always try to stand out. That way people explain things to you, but if you try to blend in, they could spot a phony right away. And which is the reason why Tom Wolfe always wore that dapper white suit. And it was completely obvious that I was a stranger who should be treated very warily and with caution. And this was in the days before smartphones. So I had to ask around, where is this fish market where there was this talking fish? Nobody was interested in helping me. Everybody just gave me these like little one-word answers. I mean, this was like about 17 or 18 years ago, but I could still remember the look on the face of this woman who I asked her, she heard of the talking fish and just this, like, who are you look. And I remember thinking something similar, visiting some of the Hasidic neighborhoods of Brooklyn, like Borough Park. They were isolated little shtetls, little towns just incorporated into the city of New York and the subway system almost by accident. And to a certain extent, it was these kinds of shtetls that were in my thinking when I began constructing the town of Kreskel, which is at the center of my book, The Lost Shtetl. So a long time ago, I remember reading a passage from Saul Bellows' book, To Jerusalem and Back, where he's traveling on an airplane next to a Hasidic guy. And he has to explain to him what a mathematician is and who Albert Einstein was. Which, if anybody has read the book, they know that I ripped that off a little bit when the protagonist of the book, Yankel, is asked by the doctors in the mental hospital if he knows who Shakespeare's Hamlet is. He says, Hamlet who? And it's the kind of thing that seemed impossible when Bellow wrote that book in 1976, and seems, doubly more impossible today, that somebody wouldn't know who Einstein was or a mathematician was. But I know a lot of people who left Hasidism who told me just how shunned American life was back when they were in the fold. Their first language was Yiddish, and their birthday was the 2nd of Kislev and not November 18th. They did not own a television or a computer. On the other hand, plenty of them did. And I think that's a part of the community that is not quite examined. But pre-pandemic, I would go to some of Brooklyn's underground poker rooms once the sun went down on Saturday night, and the room would be filled with Hasidic Jews. And I've known plenty of them who left Hasidism because they were seduced by everything else that was on display in modern life. And those were some of the themes that I was writing about in my book, The Lost Shtetl. The book is about a little village of Jews in a lonely corner of Poland that's so isolated and hermetic that it's overlooked in the Holocaust and the Cold War and the democratic transition after the Cold War until we stumble on them in the here and now. And to a certain extent, The Lost Shtetl is a time travel book. It's about a village from the past that steps into the present after all the tumult and change of the 20th century. And that's something that's very baffling to the villagers. But I also think it's a work about alienation and the battle between acceptance of modernity and technology and the rejection of that. I very much believe that a lot of us live a very cloistered life, and some of that was greatly enhanced because of the pandemic. But I'm not certain how isolation is changing us as a culture, probably in subtler ways than we know right now. But I think isolation is one of the great questions about life in 2021. Every single one of us right now is sitting in front of this piece of steel and silicon and plastic and bauxite to do this Zoom together. And this has done two things. I believe it has made life possible during the pandemic. Millions and millions of people were able to work from home because they could get on a Zoom call and send their work in over the computer, and that saved countless lives worldwide. We could order our food online rather than going into a market, and that saved lives as well. We had Netflix, and we had all these things that helped keep us distracted while we were just alone in our houses, and that preserved a certain amount of sanity, I believe. And yet I'm very ambivalent about our obsession as a culture with technology. Well prior to the pandemic, I'd go out to dinner with friends, and I would see four people sitting at a table sharing a meal together, and each had a phone in front of their face. That seems to me something that's isolating. And it's as if people are hypnotized. And I list myself in that indictment. I have a 6-year-old son. These are the most precious, poetic years of his life. And I spend them gritting my teeth because of, something on Twitter or Facebook. The phone now, tells you how much time you're spending on it every week. And it's truly one of the most maddening and depressing functions that they could have come up with. I'd rather tell you my weight than tell you how much time I spend on that phone. But it's a lot. And the phone technology makes me anxious. It makes me depressed. I found that I'm far happier when I'm not online and worrying about the immediacy of every last thing. And that is one of the things that I'm writing about in The Lost Shtetl, I think. I don't know what the answers are for this. I think that there are real advantages and disadvantages behind technology. But I don't think we've examined those questions in depth as a culture. So broadly speaking, that's what I was trying to write about. But more specifically, there's the town of Kreskel, which I mentioned. It's been there for hundreds of years. And the novel begins with this very acrimonious divorce between Pesha Lindauer and her husband Ishmael. One of them goes missing from the town, and then the other one. And the rabbis feel that they have to elevate this to the Gentiles. So they send out this mamzer, Yankel Lewenkoff, who's the hero of the story, to the nearest city. And when Yankel gets there and starts talking about his little shtetl in the forest, not only does nobody believe him, but they stick him in a mental hospital. And eventually they figure out that Yankel is telling the truth and decide that they have to try to find Kreskel and reintegrate it into contemporary Poland. And I'm going to read a passage from there. One thing you should probably know before I start reading that is that this is a little bit of a flashback. We see the rediscovery of the town, and when the villagers of Kreskel see a helicopter land in town for the first time, they think that the Messiah is coming down from heaven. So I will start at this passage where they realize at the mental hospital that Yankel is sort of telling the truth. Not sort of telling the truth, it is, he is telling the truth. Dr. Babyak took it upon herself to make the first call to the governor and felt silly explaining it to the administrator who answered the phone. There's a secret shtetl filled with Jews which survived the war, Dr. Babyak said when she was asked what the call was about. There's no danger so far as we know. They're all living just as they always did, but we thought we should tell somebody about it. The other end of the line was silent for several moments before the secretary spoke. What's a shtetl? And while the hospital spent months dithering to and fro, the wheels of government moved surprisingly rapidly. Several deputies called back, and the governor himself got on the phone a few hours later. He apparently believed that this little village had the potential to become a big media story, a modern-day Brigadoon, if you will, and everyone should be prepared. An elderly Yiddish translator was summoned from Warsaw, and several government officials descended on Our Lady of Mercy to interview the various parties involved. When they were satisfied that no hoaxes were being pulled, it was agreed the government had a duty to visit Kreskol and welcome it to its rightful place in contemporary Polish society. The only thing left to do is actually locate Kreskol, said Raymond Sikorsky, the slight, middle-aged official the voivodeship had sent to Our Lady of Mercy Hospital. We will take a helicopter over the forest tomorrow. The helicopter took off from the outskirts of town and landed in the center of Kreskol the next day, and Yankel, who had left the town as an expendable, acceptable loss in the course of finding the truly important people, was suddenly thrust into a heretofore unimaginable position of authority and wisdom. The people of Kreskol had gathered in a crowd the size of which Yankel had never seen before. They stared in stupefaction. They wept, and for the moment, Yankel was as puzzled as the Gentiles. Then he heard one of the townspeople look at the translator and cry, Moshiach. The throngs followed suit, shouting, Moshiach, 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 over and over. For not the first time since he had left his home months earlier, he realized just how simple and artless the people he left behind were, the poor souls. Of course, 3 months ago, Yankel would have no doubt had the exact same reaction. What is going on here, the rabbi asked. Is this man the Messiah? And Yankel began to explain what I recounted a few chapters earlier. After the initial shock had worn off somewhat, it was decided that the succeeding business should be conducted in a less public setting. Who are these people? Rabbi Sokolow asked Yankel after the trio had been trotted into his study and examined by the old and esteemed of Kreskol. The younger and less educated were crammed into Rabbi Sokolow's hallway, each with their ears pointed to the rabbi's oak door, eager to hear the miraculous news for themselves. This man is Raymond Sikorsky, Yankel said, introducing the short, bespectacled Gentile with the receding hairline who carried with him the aura of leadership. He is with the voivodeship. And who is he? Rabbi Sokolow asked, pointing to the aged, shrunken Jew who had jumped out of the chariot with the Gentile. His name is Gerard something, Yankel replied. He's here to translate. Rabbi Sokolow looked as if he was trying to weigh his words before he spoke, anxious not to offend anyone's sensibilities, particularly one who might have the imprimatur of holiness. So he's not the Messiah, Rabbi Sokolow asked. The translator chuckled softly to himself. No, I'm not anybody important, he ventured in Yiddish. A more worldly observer would place his accent in Riga. He then gestured to the Gentile chieftain. He's the important one, which were largely the last words he would speak for himself. Good people of Kreskol, the translator said a few moments later to the chieftain, I'm here to fill you in on everything you might have missed. Yes, we missed a lot. I have sometimes lost track of what Sikorsky told us that afternoon and what we later learned over the course of the next few months. But the fundamentals of the last century were recounted. World War II, the Cold War, the creation of the State of Israel, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, a man on the moon, the eradication of polio, the instant coffee powder, even if normal coffee was an unfamiliar commodity in these parts. When Sikorsky spoke about World War II, he was determined that we would not be left with the same doubts as Yankel Lewinkov. He produced 11 photographs, which he placed on the rabbi's wooden desk for each man to examine for himself. Millions died, the Gentile explained, pointing to the glossy black and white images of Babi Yar, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. Poland was almost completely cleansed of Jews. As he said the word cleansed, the Gentile's face changed color, as if he had accidentally said something impolite. And that's all I'll read for today. But I welcome any questions anybody might have. And I guess I'll put myself in Judy, your hands, Howard's hands.
Yep. We're ready to accept any questions. You can type in the chat. You can raise your computer hand. You can let me know that you have a question and we can assist with the questions and direct. So we have one question that is, are you writing another book? I can't wait. So are you just, I think you said that, but if you would say it again or
Of
talk about
course.
your book.
Sure. Well, Howard had asked me this question when we first spoke. That was like his first question to me was, are you writing another book? So since I turned this book in, and it takes like a really long time from the time, I finished the first draft to sending it to an editor, to getting it agreed to be published, to publishing it to now. So I had been working that whole time. And I'd written a bunch of short stories. So I had lunch with my agent right before the pandemic, and I said, how about a collection of short stories? And he said, they never sell. So my next thing is going to be a collection of short stories. I have a collection of short stories that I just finished that my agent is taking his time getting back to me about. And I have another book, which is actually a children's book that I'm a little bit more than halfway finished. And after that, I have about 5 different ideas for novels, and I have to settle on the next one. But that will be in a couple of months.
Gloria, you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Max. I really enjoyed the book. I was wondering, with all your plans for future books, whether you thought about a sequel. I mean, I certainly was wondering about Pesha and Yankala, whether they do go back to the village, to the shtetl. How would they navigate that? This prostitute, I mean, I hate to call her because, again, I mean, but she would be viewed that way if she went back to the shtetl.
Mhm.
And, what could possibly be, or whether they would meet up again, or whether, they could forge a life together. So I just wondered if you thought about.
Well, as a lot of people have asked me about a sequel. That's like been one of the first questions. So, I think that there will be, there very well could be one in the future. It's sort of been, I've been thinking about it and starting to think about how it could be plotted. So, I think that the sequel would be the story of, Yankel's quest to find Pesha. But I would like to take some time away before I do something else, because I spent so long on the Lost Shtetl that it might be some time. No, I think that there would be obvious hurdles for them going back to Kreskel or being accepted back in Kreskel. But that's the fun of writing a book, is trying to answer those kinds of problems. So I think that a sequel, it's funny. There had been talk about optioning this book for a movie, and it hasn't happened yet, but there's been some interest. And one of the people who was very interested, I had a very long talk with, and he said, I think that it'll be a great movie. I've got this plan and I've got that plan. And one of the things that I said to them was, I think it would be a better Netflix series. It would be better to do it in pieces, because the way that the book was almost written was very episodic. Every chapter almost felt like, a complete story. All right, this is the story of the history of the town. Okay, this is the story of Yankel in the mental hospital. And this is the story of, him leaving town again and all that stuff. And the screenwriter's response was, well, they don't like to do anything that doesn't have future potential. Like that, like a single book, they would prefer something that had, long-term potential. And I was like, well, no, that's season 2 is trying to find Pesha, and like season 3 could be like, them going back to Kreskel and blah, blah, blah. So I think that there's a lot of potential for a sequel.
So Susan would like to know, do you like to write as you go along and see what develops, or do you create a story outline first?
That's a very interesting question. So this book, I came up with the idea. So I told you a little bit about my background and how this, the Holocaust was a very interesting topic for me. Shtetls, if you will, were a very interesting topic for me. And the way that I came up with the idea for this book was I was reading a book called The War Against the Jews, which was a book by Lucy Davidovich, which was a Holocaust history. And it was a very, data-heavy book. And I remember at one point just thinking about just the sweep of shtetls that were destroyed during World War II. And there were hundreds of them throughout Eastern Europe. And I had a very perverse thought, which was, how is it that none of them escaped the attention of the Nazis? And I remember thinking, well, what if one did? And it was like, oh, that's an interesting story. So that little germ of an idea sat in my head for a very, very long time. And it only really, and I started trying to write it without an outline, without anything like that, for a very long time, for like at least a year, where I would start, I was like, this is a really good idea, I have to do something with this, and it just would read very flat. And it was when I started thinking about the character of Pesha, when she started coming, more vividly in my mind, that I started thinking the break off from the town, the rediscovery of the town, the attempt at reintegration, that was the story. That's what it should be about. And I was like, okay, well, that roadmap appeared in my mind when I hit that moment of like, that this is the story of Pesha and Yankel. Then a very rough outline appeared before me, like, all right, I have to explain this, I have to do this in chapter 1, this in chapter 2, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not saying that it didn't take some big changes along the way, but that horizon was in the distance of like, of an outline. And maybe if I had a better outline, it wouldn't have taken me quite as long to write the book. But I don't know if I could have come up with, I think that the outline probably would have been a worse book if I just followed it along. Like, I don't think I would have come up with as great an outline. The outline improved as it went along, if that makes sense.
Jan, do you have a question? You need to.
Thank you
go.
very much.
There
I
you go.
appreciate it. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I don't see you anymore. I just see Judith. It's a pleasure seeing you. And if I see Max, I want to ask him a question.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. I have to tell you, I come in as a total novice. I don't know a thing. It just was so fascinating an idea. And so I don't know about your writing. However, it feels to me as if this is a basis for philosophical view of how do you integrate your appreciation and honoring your past while opening your eyes to the present and the future. And I think that we as Jews are all doing that, having one foot in those of us who love Judaism and like live Judaism in our ways, our different and separate paths. We have a foot, this may be our history and our basis and, the foundation of our values and our love. And yet we live in a modern society. So to me, if you were to write a concept of this book moving forward, if you were a philosophical writer, it's it's just a fascinating concept. How do you maintain your historical ties and also open your eyes to all the beauty that is in our present day?
Well, I mean, Jen, I'm so glad that's what you came away with, because that's exactly what I mean, look, my view of it is that it's a contradiction that has no answer. I think that both sides are right. Like, I certainly see, like, tradition as something that I'm very attracted to, interested in, and fascinated by, and I honor it. I'm not a religious person, but history is something that I've always been drawn to, and certainly the history of the Jews as, like, somebody who's had such colossal, epic ups and downs. A story that just is, you know, touches every corner of the map in ways that are just, so unexpected. Um, and yet I also really do believe in things like progress. I mean, like, something as simple as air conditioning. I mean, my God, I think of, like, what life would have been. I would have been the most miserable, cranky, horrible person. I could have never written this book without air conditioning. I would have killed somebody by then, and I would have been already in prison, like, 20 years ago. So, and that's just one thing. That's just one thing that that the modern world affords us. And, the food that we have, like the fact that there's, like, we how many years ago were we talking about, like, that the future was going to bring widespread hunger? Like, this was like a big problem in the 1960s, the population bomb, that we were never going to be able to feed, the whole world with all the number of people. And it's because of, like, science, and it's because of, like, new ways to farm, and all these new things that are good. Medicine. I mean, like, good God, like, how many vaccines do we have now? Thank God we have these vaccines. This is progress, and this is, modernity, and this is something that's a great thing. So one of the reasons why I think it's a compelling story is because both sides are essentially right, and you could see you could be drawn to one side and the other, and be a perfectly, reasonable person.
See, and I think it's more of an and than an either or. And how interesting philosophically how you view a character of your creation that would find that very moving line that honors past, present, and future at the same time. It almost would set like a paradigm for people to really look at, to say, wow, I can do both. I can honor all of the existences that are part of who I am, and part of the day that I live in. I just think it would be a fascinating, but that's more philosophical, and I don't know your reading, and maybe that's not what draws you as an author.
No, it sounds like that could be the next one, but
oh, good. I'll look for it. I promise. Right. Thank you.
Of course, of course.
Do we have additional questions? I'm not seeing any at the time. Howard, you need to unmute.
I see Eunice and John have a question.
Yes, that's John. Yeah, I've heard secondhand stories about this community in upper New York State, or outside of New York, and I'm anxious to read your book. I haven't read it, but from the stories I've heard, that community is living in the 18th century. They dress. Some of them can't sign their name in English. They can't read legal documents. How close is that to your fictional community?
Well, and I think that I know for a fact that that's the case, because I've met a lot of those people and visited them, and it's not just upstate New York. In Brooklyn, that's the case. Like, there are neighborhoods in Brooklyn. That was one of the great advantages of working at the Forward, was, it was still a very hyper local paper, like really examining these communities in depth and the problems. Sorry. No, really examining those communities in depth and getting to know them and speak to them. And I have a reporter who writes for me now in my other life is a real estate journalist who was a former Hasidic Jew. And she didn't know her English birthday until she started. Not until she like left the fold. And for a lot of them, it goes rabbi by rabbi. Some rabbis say you cannot have like a computer, internet is evil. It's the road towards leaving the fold. You must shun those technologies. And then there are others who, not only use it, but are like, the most expert in the internet that anybody I've ever met. Like, they're brilliant at it. I think that shtetl life does live in some form in America today, and in Israel, and in a bunch of other communities where there are a lot of these sects of Hasidism. And I know it well because I know the people.
You speak Yiddish?
Sadly, no. There's a character in the book, Pesha, and her great flaw is that she can't learn Polish. She's like, she just speaks Yiddish. She every time she tries to learn the language, she just stumbles. She has no head for it. That's me. I was like, the bad kid in Hebrew school. They all said that I'm an idiot. When I took French for 6 years in 4 years in high school and 2 years before high school, and in the 6th year, my mother and father went to parent night at the school, and they said, "Hi, we're Max Gross's parents," and the French teacher goes, "Oh, you're Max Gross's parents. He is such a nice boy, but so stupid." This is an actual quote that she said. She said this, and in a room full of other parents too. She was like, "Max Gross, you're so stupid." So, I'm so stupid when it comes to but when I worked at the Forward, it was there was the Yiddish paper. So the Yiddish paper was right there. I used to speak to those guys all the time. And I was always fascinated with it. And I was also very fascinated with Yiddish literature in translation. So I really got to know that. But like, I know like the words like, like ganef or something like that, or, all the swears I know, like schmuck, putz, all that stuff. I could go that, no problem. But when it comes to actually knowing Yiddish, my parents know a little bit of it. My grandparents know a little bit more of it. And my great-grandparents spoke it. And I knew one great-grandfather, but it was a copy of a copy of a copy by the time it got to me.
So next question is in the chat. Myra asks, how did you know about Polish government structure or the forest in northern Poland where the shtetl was located?
Well, Myra, I did cheat a little bit in the sense that I made up the province where Kreskol exists. But I figured I'm making up a town, I might as well make up a province. But I did visit Poland in the course of writing the book. And I read a lot about Poland, contemporary Polish politics, as well as just what Polish history. There's a pretty good book. I think the guy's name is Adam Zamoyski, and I might be mispronouncing it. If you buy my book, it actually is in the end notes. Hang on one second. Let me see if I can find it. Which was pretty good book about Poland. I mean, I've been reading about it in the news because there have been so many changes that have happened in the Polish, political system since I just started writing it. It took on a very different character over the course of the last few years. Ultra nationalistic in a way that I have found fairly disturbing. Adam Zamoyski, Poland: A History, was one of the books that I consulted about Poland. But I also have a lot of friends who, are Polish, and I would talk to them. I remember I have this friend from high school that I, grew up with, and I would send him, just all sorts of questions about Poland. And I remember one of the ones that I asked him about was, I was like, there's those of you who have read the book, and I think it's been alluded to already on the chat. There's a big piece that takes place in a brothel with a prostitute, and I said to him, what's the legality status of prostitution in Poland? He's like, believe it or not, Max, I don't know anything about prostitutes in Poland right now. So I had a friend who was a resource, but I did have to do a great deal of research on my own as well. If in terms of contemporary Poland, for like an overview of what's happening now, there's a pretty interesting book called, I think it's called The Twilight of the Democracies by Anne Applebaum, who is the wife of, she's an American journalist. She's the wife of a Polish politician. And she is herself a kind of controversial figure in Poland, and the victim of not a little bit of anti-Semitic abuse in the media there. But she has a pretty good, in that book, The Twilight of the Democracies, there's a pretty good overview of what's happening in contemporary Polish politics.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that you lived in Israel for a year. How did that influence you, and did it influence the book at all? And what was your general feeling about living there?
Well, yeah, I would. It was a very formative experience. I was, just out of college when I moved to Israel, and it was just after the Intifada started. So it was a very fraught time to be there. And Israel is a small enough country that spending a year there, you got to see pretty much all of it. Like, there were very few, there were places that I didn't go in, say, like the West Bank or something like that. But the major cities, Haifa, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Eilat, north to south, I was able to see the whole country, and able to, meet a lot of people while I was there, and sort of gauge there were a lot of things that it did for me personally, and that it probably helped the book at. I was not a very religious person growing up. I was very interested in Jewish history. I was very interested in Jewish books, but I was not a practicing Jew. And one of the things it taught me about the religious life in a way that I had not seen before. I would go to people's homes, and I would stay with them, and I would, go to synagogue with them and learn the prayers in a way that I really hadn't paid that much attention to as a child. And I think that that was a very valuable thing for writing a book like this. But it was a very valuable thing to sort of just be a stranger in the country who doesn't speak the language as well. That's the story. That's one of the main, stories of this book, and that was my experience. Like, it certainly wasn't like them in the sense that people spoke English everywhere. In fact, if they found out that you were an American. They didn't want to try to speak in Hebrew, my horrible Hebrew, which nobody could understand anyway. But they really wanted the chance to practice their English, whether it was Jews or Palestinians or whoever, or Bedouins, whoever you were talking to. And that makes my experience a little bit different. But I was able to walk around Haifa, not by myself alone as a 21, 22-year-old. It was an interesting experience.
Do we have other questions?
I have another question that has nothing to do with nothing. You mentioned that you interviewed Mel Brooks. I love Mel Brooks. I think he's the funniest man around. What was that experience like?
I'll tell you something. So I'll tell you the funniest thing Mel Brooks said to me, which was, a couple of years earlier, his son, Max Brooks, had written this zombie book called World War Z. And I wrote a long profile of Max Brooks for the forward. And when I interviewed Mel Brooks, he was about to have Young Frankenstein out on Broadway. He'd had this huge success with the producers, and so they wanted to duplicate that with Young Frankenstein. So he was doing all sorts of press. And I got on the phone with him and started taking my notes and asked him this, that, and the other thing. And at the end of the interview, I said to him, I should tell you, I know your son Max. I did a piece about your son Max Brooks. He said to me, "Of course. Why do you think I agreed to do the interview with you? You were kind to my child," which I thought was a very Jewish father thing to say. I thought it was very charming. But so yeah, he was it was a half hour on the phone, but even in a half an hour, he was a charming fellow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. As far as Mel Brooks, there was so much controversy, remember, about the play The Producers, whether he should, at the beginning, but then it was a hit. But what I wanted to ask you was, when you were in Israel, I think Sheldon Adelson owned the major newspaper there. Did you by any chance ever meet him, or wasn't he and his wife so well liked and almost beloved over there?
I actually think that Adelson's
Adelson.
I think that he came on the scene much later than I was there in 2001, 2000 to 2001. So that was more than 20 years ago at this point. And I don't believe he bought that newspaper until, I want to say, like middle to late part of the first decade. So like 2006 or 7 or something like that. I think is when he became active there. When I was in Israel, I don't think anybody had ever heard of Sheldon Adelson. I hadn't.
Really? Uh-huh. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know he gave so much money to the people, to Israel, so much.
He did. He was a big believer in Israel. But I've never met the guy.
Well, I think this was a wonderful program. Do we have additional questions? Max, this was really a wonderful program, and I'm just can't wait to read your book. Howard, do we have anything else?
No, I think that's it. I want to thank Max for agreeing to come on. I'm sure our friends in St. Louis have enjoyed it. And those who haven't read the book, hopefully they will read it. And we all look forward to his next works.
Well, thank you so much, Howard, for arranging this, for suggesting it. And thank you so much for getting a chance to actually see you. I'd just known the voice. I hadn't known the face. And now I know your face. And next time we'll do it in St. Louis.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Next year in St. Louis.
Next year in
Yay,
St. Louis.
onto your next book.
With our air conditioning, you mentioned not being able to write your book without air conditioning. You know, St. Louis was the hottest place in the world. When the baseball teams would come here, they always hated to play here because there was no air conditioning. It was so hot in the summertime. So
And I'm sure that, like, eating 5 pounds of barbecue would not help in that, right? I mean, so I should probably not do that if I came down there. But I love barbecue. I don't know if I could
Good.
resist, but anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending today. And Max, I hope we can have you back and hopefully in person.
Anytime, anytime.
thank
Thank
you,
you so
Max.
much, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Judy.